History is not always a tale of triumph and progress. Sometimes it is a story of blood, chains, and the depths of human cruelty. Tonight we step into one such chapter, a story of stolen lives, broken families, and the brutal machinery of oppression. A story that begins in the heart of Africa and stretches across the Atlantic into the very fabric of the United States of America. This is the story of African slavery, a tale not only of suffering but of survival, resilience, and the unyielding spirit of a people who refuse to be erased. Before we begin, if you want to uncover more hidden truths from history's darkest corners, make sure to subscribe to Chronicles. Your support helps us shine a light on the past and keep these stories alive. The year is 1619. A battered English privateer, the White Lion, sails into Point Comfort, Virginia. On board are roughly 20 African captives taken from a Portuguese slave ship bound for Mexico. These men and women become the first recorded Africans to arrive in the English colonies of North America. Their status is ambiguous, neither fully enslaved nor fully free. But this moment marks the beginning of what would become a brutal, race-based system of slavery. But this is not where the horror begins. The journey of these souls started long before in the villages of West Africa, where entire communities were raided, families torn apart, and human beings shackled like animals. For centuries, West Africa was home to powerful empires: the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. These civilizations thrived through trade, culture, and advanced governance. But by the 15th century, European powers, driven by the thirst for profit, began exploiting Africa's people. The Portuguese were the first European nation to engage in the African slave trade, establishing the first major slave fort at Elmina, Ghana, in 1482. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the British, French, Dutch, and Spanish had all built similar fortresses along the coast, places like Gorée Island in Senegal and Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. These fortresses became dungeons of despair, where men, women, and children were crammed into dark, airless cells, awaiting the ships that would take them into the abyss. They were stripped of their names, their dignity, and their homeland. Bound in iron, they were forced onto ships, embarking on the most horrific journey of all, the Middle Passage. From the early 1500s to the mid-1800s, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic. Of those, roughly 10.7 million survived the voyage, the rest perishing in unimaginable conditions. The ships were floating coffins. Men were chained together in cramped, disease-ridden holds, packed so tightly they could barely move. The stench of human waste filled the air. Dysentery, smallpox, and malnutrition claimed lives by the hundreds. Those too weak to continue were thrown overboard, their bodies devoured by sharks that trailed the ships, waiting for their next meal. Some captives chose to leap into the ocean rather than endure the agony of what lay ahead. Others rebelled, attempting to seize control of the ships. But for most, the nightmare would only deepen upon reaching the shores of the Americas. Upon arrival, enslaved Africans were stripped naked, examined like livestock, and sold to the highest bidder. Families were torn apart, never to be reunited. A mother could be sent to a plantation in Virginia, her husband to a rice field in South Carolina, and their children to sugarcane fields in Louisiana. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, slavery became the backbone of the American economy. The plantations of the South thrived on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, producing tobacco, rice, sugar, and most of all, cotton. By the early 1800s, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 had transformed cotton into the most profitable crop in America. This economic boom intensified the demand for enslaved labor. The domestic slave trade exploded, tearing apart black families as enslaved people were bought and sold across the country. From sunrise to sunset, enslaved people labored in the fields under the burning sun, their backs bent, their hands raw from picking cotton. Overseers wielded whips to enforce order. If a person worked too slowly, they were beaten. If they attempted escape, they were tracked down by bloodhounds, their flesh torn, their feet mutilated. Punishments were not just physical, they were psychological. Slaveholders forbade literacy, fearing that an educated enslaved person would seek freedom. They tore apart families to crush the human spirit, and yet the spirit refused to break. Despite the brutality, enslaved Africans resisted at every turn. Some, like Nat Turner, led armed revolts, striking fear into the heart of the South. Others, like Harriet Tubman, orchestrated daring escapes through the Underground Railroad, guiding enslaved people to freedom under the cover of night. They resisted in small ways too, breaking tools, slowing down work, preserving their culture through music and storytelling. Their resistance laid the foundation for future generations to continue the fight for freedom. The Civil War tore America apart, with slavery at its center. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free. But true freedom would not come until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, abolishing slavery across the United States. But the chains were not truly broken. For a brief moment during Reconstruction, Black Americans experienced newfound rights. They were elected to political office, established businesses, and created schools. But white supremacists fought back. Jim Crow laws, enacted in the late 19th century, stripped Black Americans of their rights. Segregation, voter suppression, lynching, these were the new tools of oppression. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black communities, ensuring that freedom remained an illusion. It would take another 100 years of struggle, of marches, of bloodshed, for America to begin confronting its past. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, these were just a few of the voices that rose against injustice, demanding what should have never been denied: equality. The Civil Rights Movement led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, marking a turning point in the fight against racial oppression. But racism did not vanish, it evolved. From redlining to mass incarceration, from police brutality to systemic discrimination, the scars of slavery remain etched into America's foundation. The echoes of the past still shape the present. This is not just history, this is the present. The ghosts of the past linger in the soil, in the streets, in the fight for justice that continues today. We must remember. We must speak their names. We must ensure that history does not repeat itself. If you believe these stories must not be forgotten, share this video, let the world know. And if you wish to uncover more hidden truths from history, subscribe to Chronicles, where we bring light to the darkest corners of our past. Remember the lost, remember the fight, remember the truth.